the Garau people, and particularly welcome the Assistant Minister for Climate Change, Energy and Emergency Management. I'll invite him to the stage first to start with some opening remarks.
Thanks, Christy. Good evening, everyone. It's great to be here at the Australia Pavilion. This is my first formal event at the Australia Pavilion for Beleng 2025, COP30. It is good to be here again. No, louder, even louder. My God, it's loud here, I can tell you. But it's great that the first event in the pavilion for me is with ASFI, such a fantastic group. We've just had a really good conversation about the challenge of getting the capital that is available, the capital that wants to flow into the kind of investments that we have to see, getting the obstacles out of the way, creating the channels that will see the weight of that potential change become real change. You know, this is the implementation COP. It's the COP of truth, as some people have described it. We have to see more real change occur, and we need private finance to be part of that. Australia is working with partners and is very keen, has been very glad to collaborate with ASFI in starting to identify and make some changes that are needed. The Australian Australian Sustainable Investment Taxonomy is a great example of that. And while it is a kind of a governance change, and to some people might strike them if you sort of said sustainable investment taxonomy, might find themselves feeling a bit faint. It is a critical mechanism to deliver what we need to see. We need to see more of. We're glad as the Australian government to support it, and we know that there's potential to take it further, to make sure that it covers more kinds of investment, and to line it up with other aspects of the Australian sort of investment environment, ecosystem and architecture. So it's a pleasure to be here with ASFI folk and with all of you, and I'm going to look forward to listening to this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Assistant Minister Wilson. And taxonomy is indeed a tricky word. My kids call it a taxidermy. That is not what we're talking about. You'll hear a lot more about taxonomies, but transition finance in particular during the session. So you've probably heard the stat that the investment needs across the climate transition are $6.5 trillion a year by 2030. That's across OECD countries as well as emerging markets in China. Something that we also know is that clear definitions and frameworks are essential for underpinning private capital to be able to identify those opportunities that are aligned with the transition across markets. To support that need, we've seen taxonomies emerge in nearly 60 jurisdictions, and what they do is very much identifying assets and activities that are aligned with the climate transition. What we often hear from global investors and financial institutions is that this proliferation of national standards increases complexity for them. But the activities and assets that are needed for climate transition in different jurisdictions is necessarily based on individual countries' circumstances, and the role that different economic sectors need to play in different countries to reach national targets will be different, yet the global ambition under the Paris Agreement remains. Australia released our taxonomy in June this year, June 2025, and it's now being used across the finance and corporate sectors in Australia. Given the transition challenge that we've got across many sectors, not just the energy sector, through the development of the taxonomy, we've established credible yet pragmatic approach to defining transition. And that's now being drawn on by international market standard setters like the Loan Markets Association and the Transition Finance Council in the UK. Very much looking forward during this session to sharing the Australian experience with others, but also to exploring with our excellent panel, who I'll introduce in a moment, how we might get to a global approach on transition finance, something that global financial institutions identify as critical to unlocking the trillions in private capital that's needed. So to kick us off, I'd like to first introduce Nicole Yazbek-Martin, the Executive Manager of Standards and Practice from the ASFI team, who will give us a bit of a presentation, an overview of transition finance, not just in the Australian taxonomy, but how that methodological approach can be applied and used in other places as well. Over to you, Nicole.
Okay. Wasn't too sure what the cause of that is, but it seems to be working now. So we're going to talk a little bit about transition finance, and it is a word that is increasingly being used in the context of pretty much about absolutely everything. We know that the globe, our economies need to transition, and we've started to look at transition finance in a number of different ways. And although there is no standard definition of what transition finance is, what we are starting to understand is that there are component parts of what is needed for transition. And so the conceptualization of transition is really starting to emerge in different angles, but that conceptualization is not harmonious across the board. So what we are seeing is the excellent work of the TPT, the Transition Planning Task Force, thinking about if you're a corporation, what planning do you need to put in place, what transparency measures and what frameworks do you need to start to plan out your transition. But that in and of itself is not going to get capital mobilized. You have the Australian approach, and we really thought deeply about what was the driving force of our taxonomy when we developed it, and the number one area that we were looking at was the mobilization of capital. So we were thinking about it from an investment point of view. What is the capex? What is the actual investment that needs to happen in order to transition? But you are also getting different emerging approaches, people referring to transition in relation to decarbonizing hard-to-abate sectors, like in industry, like in agriculture, and that's true. And then unfortunately, you're also getting an association of transition finance that is very closely linked to financing of fossil fuels and the transition of fossil fuels. And I think what we do need to do is start unpacking this so that we understand what we mean by transition and how do we get capital mobilizing in this space. And what we did when we developed the Australian taxonomy is essentially develop a methodology that distinguishes between two key things. There are investments that you can make that are what we call transitory. So this is emissions reduction off a baseline, but ultimately there's no see-through to where the destination point is. And what this is essentially going to create is a set of carbon lock-in that is ultimately going to extend our road to net zero. And in the meantime, we may have a more lumpy transition and stranded assets. So when we talk about transition, how do we define and conceptualize transition and the investments that we need to make that are going to get us to our end goal? And our end goal is a net zero economy. And I think I've just touched on this a little bit. I think the risks in investing or not understanding when we talk about transition and not distinguishing between these two things is really apparent from an investor point of view when we talk about transition risk and stranded assets, but also from an economic point of view, right? If we're investing in business as usual, we're going to maintain business as usual. And the opportunities that lie on the other side of the economic transition are not going to be realized. But importantly, every single time that we delay, we are delaying the stopping of global warming and the stabilization of our climate. And so inevitably, we know that we are going to need to get to net zero. And locking in high carbon assets just delays our capacity to stabilize our environment and start to reduce carbon emissions in the atmosphere. So what we have started to see, and the work that ASFI's done, is that we've started to identify across different markets, there are key components that are the essence of a credible transition that are emerging across the world. And so the excellent work that the UK Transition Finance Council is doing, we have, I think, at least 2 of our panel members that are also on that task force. The guidelines and the very solid framework that the Loan Markets Association put out recently, and the work of the Transition Finance Council, the Transition Finance, I don't know what they're called now, TPT Evolved, the network, really all build on the essential approach that ASFI has taken, which is to look at can we identify that investment that's going to get us to the end goal? And what we have found is that there's actually a lot in common, and people are coming from it from different angles. So at the activity level, looking at that CapEx, which is really where taxonomy sit in, at the transparency and the framework level, looking at that accountability so investors can understand what that roadmap is, and the linking between CapEx spend and transition plans, and how investors can really understand and judge the credibility of the transition. But also importantly, understanding local context. And I'll talk a little bit about this because this is the nub and the heart of where I think there's a lot of confusion happening with transition finance. So, while there is a lot of conversions, I think importantly, we're also starting to see a divergence in terms of approaches to transition. And a lot of the argument around what is and what isn't in transition is under this banner of inclusive transition. And I think the important thing to note is that inclusive transition means you need to understand the starting point of a country and a market. You need to understand what their specific pathway is, but we need to support those markets to move to net zero and essentially help them in the same pace and capitalize on the same opportunity that emerging markets are looking at. So inclusive transition should not mean that we are encouraging emerging markets to be on a different standard where they are investing in and locking in high carbon assets, particularly in their energy investment sector, that is ultimately never going to get them to the opportunity set that we as developed markets are seeing in the green energy transition. And I think there's a lot of confusion between the capital costs of transitioning in emerging markets, where green investment is around 3 times that of developed markets, versus the pathways. Because the pathways are actually clear. The starting point might be different, but we need to mobilize capital and de-risk such that emerging markets can also capitalize on the green transition, not lock them into high carbon assets indefinitely under the guise of transition. And so what we really are starting to emerge and see from all the different pieces is actually a consensus around a credible framework and principles for transition. And although, this is what we've sort of scoped as in the Venn diagram where everybody can agree. And the first and foremost is our destination needs to be the same. We need the Paris Agreement objectives is the light on the hill. And we have global scenarios and localized scenarios from the IEA, from the IPCC, which already provides a lot of that differentiation between emerging markets and developed economies, but ultimately all the pathways lead to a destination that is a safe planet and green economic opportunities for everyone. And so that Paris-aligned objective needs to be the number one principle. Secondly, what we know is that underpinning, if we start with that as our guidelines and we start with the science as our guidelines, we can then frame up our transparency, we can frame up our transition plans on a pathway that's going to get us to the end goal. And so I almost see the one as a necessary precondition to being able to build your credible transition plan and operate within that context. And then linked to your credible transition plan, that transparency, is how are we tracking that over time? And this is where things like taxonomies, activities, CapEx spend comes in. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, an emissions profile of an organization is going to stay the same if they keep operating under the same conditions. And it's when they are turning over their assets and when they're making those fundamental investments that we see that emissions trajectory curve start. So that once we, based on science, align to clear transition pathways that get us to net zero, we are able to account for and develop a set of criteria and identify the key levers across multiple jurisdictions that are going to get us to the end goal. And so what all of this actually brings up is an obvious kind of set of safeguards. Because if we're, again, working on that net zero objective as our end goal, and we're using that to inform the activities and the CapEx that we invest in, and we're using that to inform the transition plans that we're putting in place on how are we going to get there with our investment, what we will start to see is benchmarked in science. So our pathways are going to be benchmarked on what we actually need to do. The time horizon of the asset and the investment in that asset, and whether or not that time horizon leads to lock-in or whether or not it's moving the dial forward, will become apparent. The capacity to decarbonize. Not every pathway is equal to another pathway. There are sectors and activities that have a massive carbon emissions intensity gap between where we are and where we need to get to, and recognizing that and not being fanciful about where those pathways exist and where those pathways are very structurally difficult to handle is important. And of course, where there is existence of low carbon alternatives, we need to be acting now to avoid that carbon lock-in. And lastly, but not least, I think what this approach really gives us is something that is, investments that we make today needs to have a direct impact on the emissions reductions of tomorrow. And so that impact orientation is really important. So, I think what we're really learning from our experience with the Australian taxonomy, thinking about it from a capital mobilization perspective, is that a really credible set of principles that are emerging across the work that is happening in the world around transition finance can really help guide capital to that end goal, which is exactly where we want it to be. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nicole. And what better group of people than the ones we've got sitting here on the stage to discuss and dig into this topic of transition finance and how their organisations are thinking about it. I'd like to introduce our panellists. We've got Rahul Ghosh, the Global Head of Sustainable Finance of Moody's Ratings. We've got Nathan Fabian, the Chief Responsible Investment Officer at PRI. And we've got Maria Nazarova-Doyle, the Global Head of Sustainable Finance at IFM Investors. And as Nicole mentioned, both Rahul and Maria sit on the Transition Finance Council Working Group as well, so looking forward to having those perspectives in too. I'll start from here and then I'll come and sit next to you, Rahul. But the first question, lots of your organisations are thinking in different ways about transition finance. I might start with Nathan, PRI with very much a global signatory base. You largely supporting investors to integrate both risks and opportunities into the way that they think about things. How does PRI think about transition finance, Nathan?
Hi, can you hear me reasonably well? I've got a yes in row 5, fantastic. So our investors own a little bit of everything in the economy. So they own all the emissions and they own all the clean stuff, basically. And so transitioning of the emissions intensive activities is of critical importance to investors. I would say the holy trinity of tools for these investors is the ISSB disclosure standards, transition plans, and taxonomies. If we can have the holy trinity in each market, we've got the opportunity of capital markets coping with that transition because they'll have the right comparable information and they'll have criteria that they can use. One reflection, we've worked on taxonomies in many countries, and the big mistake that Europe made was that it started with a regulation that did not contemplate a transitional category or a level of performance that wasn't yet green. And so I think we probably wanted Europe to go first with what was green, but there was a consequence arising from that, and that created this space that has to be filled, and that is, what does a good set of criteria look like to articulate when you're improving, and you're improving sufficiently well, but you're not quite green. And so when we worked in Europe, we had to come up with a fudge, something they call level 2 in Europe, which is not really transparent to people. It wasn't clear. But a lot of the learning has been adopted by Australia. And Australia's transition criteria approach is really, really good. And what we need now is a staging moment where the world sees that there's some government backing for these criteria. So we did very good work in Europe, but there was no government backing because it wasn't contemplated in the regulation and it was too hard to deal with politically. Remember that problem on nuclear and gas? That blew up the whole transition conversation. There was no way back for Europe, not for many years. But in Australia, we haven't had that problem. And so there is a moment here where Australia and a few other governments could get together and back in the methodology for the transition criteria that we have been here. Canada would be good. They'd probably come in. Japan would probably come in. Bit of effort. And then we create this moment of confidence for the market. So that's my key message. There's an opportunity. The work's good. there's still a gap. And you can tell that the market's struggling because things like sustainability-linked bonds, like that market is really struggling because no one's still confident on the level of performance. But the work that's been done here is solid. If a few governments get behind it, we've got a chance to establish it in the market's mind, and then we can deal with that mass of assets that we all partly own, which needs to be transitioned. I'll stop there.
We'll definitely come back. We'll definitely come back to that opportunity and what that opportunity could look like further in the discussion. Rahul, Moody's has a strong focus on assessing the credibility of companies' transition and integrating those assessments into your credit ratings. It'd be good to hear a bit more about how you think about transition and credible transition in particular.
Yeah, and countries as well, actually, Chrissy. But before I go in, I just wanted to say we've been really proud at Moody's to work with ASFI over the last few years and a lot of the work they're doing. There are lots of sustainable finance initiatives, but very few that have the kind of punch that ASFI has. So congrats on all your work. Credit rating agency, why do we care about transition? We care about it because the risks from policy shifts, market shifts, technology shifts are having a material and in some cases pretty disruptive impact on the most exposed sectors. So let me put some numbers around that. We rate around 12,500 governments, banks, companies worldwide. It's about $76 trillion of rated debt. Of that 12,500, there are about 1,250, so about 10% of that portfolio, where transition risk is already a material credit consideration in the credit rating. And for a quarter of that portfolio, let me do my maths, about 250, 300, the rating is ostensibly lower because of the impact that transition risks, whether it's policy shifts, whether it's technologies, are having on those sectors. So my message here is that transition is already impacting access and costs of capital for the most exposed. Now, as a rating agency, we want to understand, well, what are the investments you're making? How is that going to impact your future business model, your balance sheet? And to what extent is that going to protect you from these policy risks, market shifts, technology shifts? And if so, can we look beyond the near-term increase in CapEx because we think your overall credit profile will be on a much more stable plane going forward? And that's where credible transition plans are so important, right? So when a company engages with us and it can show us very detailed, year by year, step by step plans around how they're going to decarbonize their operations, how they're going to unlock new green revenue opportunities, what are the tough decisions as an organization they're going to have to make, which are the technology choices they're going to back. When we have that level of detail, it gives us confidence that this company is really looking to manage that exposure, and we can then factor that into how we think about the credit profile going forward. So I just wanted to provide, Christy, a bit of a perspective between the risk, the impact that's having on cost of capital, but then how a credible plan, and we can talk about what that means, can really help, whether it's a rating agency, but also other analysts in the market, really have confidence around the journey that company's taking.
And I might just pick you up on that credible plan, kind of how do you assess credibility and implementability or execution capacity of companies?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's sort of, the simple answer is it depends, because it sort of depends on the sector and the region. And obviously we have a very specific lens when we look at transition. We're looking at to what extent is that impacting your ability to repay your debt. Many people may have a different lens, and I'm sure Maria will talk about some of the lenses from the investor perspective. But through that credit lens, we're really focused on three areas of what makes a credible plan. One is, frankly, just information flow, right? Do we have details on the baseline years, the sector benchmarks you're using, the full scope of the emissions that are being covered within your plan? The more detail you're giving us, generally, the more granular and credible the plan is. Secondly, have you tied that plan back to business relevant outcomes? Have you done the work on what that CapEx means for your debt financing plans going forward? Have you done the work around how those investments will lead to cost efficiencies in your production process or even unlock green revenue opportunities? And then finally, we look for stickability. And by that I mean, is your plan shareholder backed? Do you have interim periods where you're going to update? Is your board, intimately involved in that process? Because if it's stickable, that means that when the business cycle or the credit cycle turns, you're going to remain committed to that plan.
I like that term, stickability. I think we'll adopt that. Maria, IFM Investors, a global investor. You've got a climate transition labelled fund, but you invest across a whole lot of different asset classes and think about transition finance, I'm sure, across all of those things. How do you think about credibly assessing transition, whether that's of companies or assets or in other work that you do?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. So IFM Investors have about $200 billion of private market investments, majority of it is, and we're very much focused on infrastructure. So transition planning is of critical importance for infrastructure because this is what the society relies on. It's basically the cornerstone of everything, and we need to make sure we take it from brown to green over time in the organized sort of way, right? So when we think about assessing transition plans, we actually first start with putting transition plans in place. So when we get an asset, we need to make sure that it has a credible transition plan in place. And to do that, we developed an internal methodology, which is an in-house proprietary methodology. However, you won't be surprised to hear that it's very much based on the work of the Transition Plan Task Force with elements of CDP and SBTI and TCFD. So sort of took all the bits that are, the greatest hits, essentially brought them together in a way that works for large, chunky infrastructure assets. So that's kind of step one. We go in and we work with the asset to make sure that there's a plan in place that is in line with our transition plan playbook, we call it. And once that's in place, we then go and work with those assets to make sure that that transition plan improves in maturity. So there's a framework for assessing the maturity of transition plans, because you can have, maybe a target and a little bit of detail behind it, and that would be a transition plan, but sort of a very starting level. There are 4 levels, from foundation to developing to established and embedded. And then the work becomes of how do we take this transition plan and the approach that the company is taking from that sort of entry-level position, okay, they have some targets and they have some willingness to do it, to how do we make sure all of it is embedded in climate governance, they have good emissions reporting, they assess and prepare, for transition risks, for physical risks, and how well do they actually integrate all of this in their company operations, procedures, is it really embedded throughout everything the company does. So we assess it, we measure it, and we help work with the companies to help them progress on that maturity scale. And we have our overall net zero target for 2050, but we also have an absolute emission reduction target for 2030. And through all this work that we're doing, we're actually now 66% of the way towards it. So we're kind of outperforming on our emissions reduction targets, and we are measuring it in absolute emissions because that is what is really important, So yeah, in this way, as green in our portfolio equates to green in the economy because it's the actual emission reductions in the economy through the infrastructure assets that we own. And just to say that as of the end of last year, 60% of our assets are at the sort of the top higher levels in terms of their transition plan maturity, and we're focusing on the others to try and get them all to the same place.
I'll bring Nicole in now. And Nicole, in the presentation, you mentioned that there is both a convergence and sort of a set of principles emerging from the different approaches to transition, but there's also somewhat of a divergence. In lots of discussions that you've had both in Australia and internationally, what are some of the challenges of these diverging approaches to transition finance definitions? What are some of those challenges creating?
So I think one of the things that we really need to understand is that the transition is complex, right? And there are multiple pathways, although they are converging, right? So technology, we're not where we were 15 years ago, right? We know the solutions that are starting to emerge from credible pathways to net zero, but it is still quite detailed and quite sophisticated, right? And what you have is an investment community that is bombarded with information around what are the credible pathways to transition. And so benchmarking is still a very tricky thing to understand and undertake. It's costly and it is not universal. And so what we've seen is a lot of misinformation in the market around what is an investment that is transition and what isn't an investment in transition. And I've been very surprised by, facts that are thrown out. Oh, this is a transition mechanism. This is a transition fuel. And how few people are saying transition to what, right? And I think the most important thing that we need to get to is a clarity on the endpoint, because the endpoint is going to guide credibility in the pathways. It's going to give clarity and comparability for investors to really be able to sift through the information to say, when I'm judging my transition plan, when I'm engaging with my clients and my portfolio companies, that we're onto something that is going to de-risk and is going to capitalize on opportunities. We're not really getting to a point of a dead end. And I think that's where we really want to get to. The significance of investing in a pathway that's going to get you nowhere or extend business as usual is going to be bad for investors, is going to be bad for the economy, and it really is going to mean that we're not going to capitalize on the opportunities. And so there are a whole lot of other reasons why we need transition, why transition is complicated and the approaches that are out there. And we absolutely need to focus on the return on capital and blended mechanisms and all of those things. But the starting point needs to be, are we all agreeing that we're headed in the right direction? And that the pathways that we've identified at a sectoral level and even at a subsectoral level are pathways that are legitimate pathways that are going to get us to the end goal.
Rahul, I might bring you in because you kind of look globally, obviously, and this idea of pathways, I know, is something that Moody's thinks about as well.
Yeah, maybe one quick question to the audience. Everyone's familiar that net zero by 2050 as a concept does not mean all sectors and all regions are net zero by 2050, right? To Nicole's point, there are going to be different paces based on how quickly carbon intensity can come down, what your starting point is in a sector or in a region. The end goal is global net zeros by 2050, but there's going to be different pathways. So with that in mind, I really like the ASFI approach of thinking about, well, where are we on that curve? And I think there has to be a distinction between the asset and what are the thresholds, what are the lock-in impacts, what are the externalities, and that definitely needs to be governed by the science. And I think it can be governed by the science. And then thinking about, well, okay, in country X versus country Y, what is the right timeline and pathway for that particular asset to be credible in the context of that jurisdiction? And that's where my concern is, that as we start to see global pathways fray, and we have more bottom-up country pathways standards, often with good intentions, but frankly not necessarily consistent, then as an analyst that becomes very, very confusing. I mean, imagining as a global investor, that becomes confusing. So I'd like to double down on the point that Nathan mentioned, which is, look, all of the thinking around this topic is coming out of Asia, Australia and Asia, whether that's Australia, whether that's Singapore, whether that's Hong Kong. Let's bring a coalition of the willing together to say, these are the pathways that we're going to use. This is why they matter, and this is how we can apply them going forward. I think that's a really important point.
I'll just give Nathan and Maria an opportunity. Where are you seeing friction from these different kind of definitions and approaches happening across, global investors or other companies that you work with?
I think the biggest issue is that nobody with enough weight in rule setting has stepped in to say this is the standard. I think that's the problem. And so we're leaving it to the market. We're like in the pre-taxonomy stage of the market, where there was lots of trialing of different approaches and there was a contest for ideas, but there's no authority standing behind it. So I think that's what's missing. I mean, there's any number of things are being tried. But while I've got the microphone, I'll just say one very important thing. No individual economic activity or technology gets to claim that they are transitional. And I'm speaking to the gas industry here. it is not plausible that anyone gets to say, we don't have to have any performance criteria. It's just not going to work. And so there's one approach that's way off the scale in terms of credibility. I think there are other methods that people have trialed, like using having Cicero give an assessment, for example. It's reasonably credible scientifically, but it's not scalable because there's no authority standing behind it and making sure it's available at low cost. And so that's really the piece that's missing.
What about from your perspective, Maria?
I think the biggest problem is the absence of globally recognized and accepted guidelines and definitions of what constitutes transition finance. And because of that, we don't have investor confidence to invest in the worry about greenwashing. We can't take global stock well at the COP, event because all those definitions differ. So we can't actually reliably estimate what transition finance flow are and what they should be. We also struggle with investment process. If you want to allocate to transition finance, like it kind of hampers your investment process because all these definitions differ. And we definitely are struggling with the communication and reporting. So I think the challenge here is to try and agree global guidelines for the UK and for Australia and other countries who have done work in this space to come together and agree some common sets of definitions. And I know that, our negotiators somewhere nearby here, they're going to be working on the global goal for adaptation, and that's kind of it's going to have a set of KPIs and measurements. So it's something like that we need, but for transition finance, so that it's mutually agreed around the world, and we can all work towards the same goal using the same measurements and the same KPIs.
Before we get into a discussion with the panel on sort of the pathways for that global harmonisation, keen to open and see if there are any audience questions before we dive into that. There's a microphone if you do have any questions.
G'day. My name. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Down the bottom, there's a button right at the bottom.
Sorry. Is it? Hello. Yep. Nope. Okay. Yeah. Is that right? Okay. G'day. My name. Great presentation. My name's Donovan Burton. I'm one of the experts on the GGA. One of the challenges we had was getting taxonomy into the conversation because of a failure of, I think, parties to understand that concept. To what extent have your organisations reached out to the parties to talk to them about the importance of taxonomy? Because we have to keep 9E6 indicator in, and I'm worried that it will go out this week. So what the indicator that we put in is for countries to have a taxonomy. And there's challenges in that. So I'm encouraging people to reach out and talk to the parties.
Forgive me, I didn't catch which process it was, but if the question is about investors and users of financial markets reaching out to parties, there's a lot of that happening over the next 2 weeks. GGA, did you say? Oh, okay. Adaptation indicators. Okay. Well, it's one of the weaker areas in our taxonomy work globally. But you guys have done some good recent work, haven't you?
I'd actually give a shout out to Sean Kidney and CBI because they've done some very detailed thinking, moving beyond process to investable opportunities. And I think absolutely to your point, where adaptation and resilience taxonomy steps in is that we know that there's a whole bunch of adaptation and resilience that is not it's not able to be private capital is not able to be mobilized for it, and that is the space where public capital is going to have to step in. But there is a huge amount of investable opportunity in adaptation and resilience where private capital can step in. And I think the approach that CBI has taken in their resilience taxonomy is to actually start to identify, so to Sean's shopping list for the future, shopping list for an adaptive and resilient future, where can the private sector step in? Where can they make capital investments into their businesses that will then alleviate the load for public capital to step in. And so we are very, very keen as the Australian Sustainable Finance Institute to lean into the space, and we're having active engagement with the Australian government to say, you know, we can really take the foundational work that CBI has done, we can play a leadership role. And I think really importantly is that whereas mitigation taxonomies have been developed very much country by country by country, I think there's a lot of cross collaboration that can happen in the development of adaptation and resilience taxonomies. We can work with our Pacific family and neighbors, we can work with others in Southeast Asia to really actually form a body of taxonomy work as we kind of step into taxonomies 2.0 that identifies those activities where private capital can flow for adaptation and resilience.
Do you want to talk about that, Sean?
No, I want to say yesterday the Brazilian government closed the $1.5 billion bond with a $750 million extra opening the old bond. 50% of the proceeds going to social resilience measures, 50% to mitigation. Classic, we're going to see. They got 5 times oversubscribed, 5 basis points benefit. Classic green bond story, but resilience was half of it. Exactly as you're saying. In other words, this is underway. There'll be another bond issued in a couple of days' time, Latin American one, resilience, and so on. And we're going to see a lot of social resilience, nature resilience, economic resilience that's coming through. But I just wanted to just pose a different question to Maria. We have a confusion, yes. Now, if we were to bring together a coalition of the Transition Pathways Initiative, Science-Based Targets Initiative, World Benchmarking Alliance, CDP, Climate Bonds Initiative, around transition guidance, with a bit of the International Energy Agency mixed in, do you think that would be enough to puncture the balloon of uncertainty of guidance? Would there be enough heft in terms of brands around guidance on transition? Because we're going to be announcing that coalition in December, and I'm curious about how it looks from your perspective, given those kinds of organisations involved working together.
Thank you. I think that would be absolutely fantastic. It would be fantastic, but you'll still need to get the government's buy-in, because everybody's developing their own, thinking that they want to push the boundaries, you know, they want to lead. And by everybody, obviously not everybody, but quite a few. And you need to make sure that they also are happy that we're going to move on to a global set. Which is helpful right now because there's a lot of innovation and a lot of people kind of running ahead trying to get something done that is useful, but bringing it together. So what you described will bring the industry together, and you then just need to bring the governments to the table as well. And perhaps if we have COP31 in Australia, that would be the time and the place to do it.
Excellent. Let's just stick with that theme of kind of what might the pathways be for this global harmonisation of definitions around transition finance. Nicole, I know this is something you and your team kind of think about, have talked to lots of people about. Why don't you kick us off and then we'll come down in this direction.
Yeah, so I mean, I think, and it's hard to say, are we going to be defining transition finance? Is it an approach? Is it a set of principles? I think at the moment I'm leaning currently, this day of the week, on a set of principles. I think what we need is, you know, the guiding North Stars in terms of what do we mean by transition and what are the guardrails around transition finance. And then how that is applied when we are issuing debt in the loan market, in the bond market, how that is applied when we're looking at our portfolio of assets, and to Maria's point, really looking through the companies and the assets that we have and whether or not they are actually tracking on that transition plan, and then how we actually define at the activity level the capex that those companies need to be making. It all needs to fit in with those set of principles, those guardrails that is going to get us to the end goal. And I think that that's the starting point. And so for us, we've been conceptualizing this for a while. We've been looking at that Venn diagram and seeing where these emerging approaches, and we actually see a very clear pathway forward in terms of the work that we've been doing. So it's not inventing something new, but it's been building on the work to say, when we talk about transition, this is what we're talking about. We're not talking about any one magic silver bullet, a fuel that is a transition fuel, a technology that is a transition technology. No. The pathway is the end goal. There are technological pathways to get to that end goal and context to get there. But how do we invest and how do we coalesce as a investable community to mobilize capital to get to that end goal.
Maria, how do you think, and particularly also drawing on the Transition Finance Council's work, because they're thinking about global applicability as well?
Yes, absolutely. So we've been talking about it already. We need the world to come together and agree on something, on the framework to end all frameworks. And hopefully some of the work of the Transition Finance Council in the UK will help towards that. But you're absolutely right, Kirsty. We need to make sure that something is globally applicable, that it has that kind of short-term action focus to help guide, these financing decisions like now in the shorter term projects rather than something kind of pie in the sky 2050 and beyond. And also needs to have well articulated dependencies, like what do we need to have to actually unlock this transition finance? What are those dependencies? And some of the other work of the UK Transition Council is very important because it's also looking at sector level transitions and how to finance sector level pathways, which something that often is omitted. So while scientists are working on a particular trajectory for decarbonization of sector, they get really excited about technology, and all of these things around it, but they're not really thinking about how to actually support this with finance. So this is something that, again, that the UK Transition Finance Council is doing, is saying, well, here's what a finance plan that supports transition plan should look like, which includes things like where's the money coming from, when is the money needed, and so when, where, and how much, right? So it sort of has your kind of, if you visualize it, you have your sectoral transition plans in terms of what's happening with the technology and how it's going, and then underneath you have those specific points where finance needs to come in, and then you can go as a government and go stimulate those finance flows, because some of it will come from government, some of it will come from private sector. There will be some mixes in the middle as well, but it's very, very important. Otherwise, those transition plans for sectors, they just stay on paper and they don't make it into the real world.
And Nathan, you've talked a bit about the power of having some governments come in as well as sort of market-facing initiatives. How do you see that working?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about the different models we're seeing, right? So we've got an ISSB standard setters model, which leads to adoption. With the taxonomies, we had national adoptions, and now we're working through our multinational fora to deal with harmonisation or interoperability. So Sean's contribution, which is always incredible and superhuman, is great, but there does have to be another step. So the markets want to see it adopted by somebody who can enforce markets. So it's got to be governments or international institutions or standard setters. So the only group we haven't discussed so far is stock exchanges. I'm not sure they give it quite enough heft. Yeah, so we just need a landing place in the financial architecture, because that's the moment when investors say, okay, now it's safe. Before that stage, it's just still something that the market will trial. And even if it's got all the intellectual work behind it, we still need a landing space in that pathway, that theory of change.
Rahul, how do you see that sort of pathway for alignment emerging?
Yeah, we've sort of been Debbie Downers, haven't we, on the challenges. I would say I think the entity level with TPT and TFC, and you can still respond to the consultation by January. I personally think we should all get behind that. The ISSB is getting behind that. That's the entity level piece, I think, sorted. Yes, we've got some work to do on asset and activity. I'm going to talk about something very niche, but is very important to me, which is one of the recommendations in the Transition Finance Council guidelines around third-party assessments, which I think are important, whether that's through certifications or other assessments. One of the benefits we have in the world of credit ratings is that any investor you speak to, regardless of who assigns a credit rating, sort of knows what the credit risk associated with a double B or a single A or a single B is, right? They're used to that market language and they can factor that in accordingly. The challenge we have with transition assessments, which of course are very emerging in this space, is there are different scales. There are different shades and colors and numbers and letters. And so I think one initiative that I would be very supportive is working with my peers, not to standardize methodologies, because I think it's important that we can innovate and be independent, but to have a general set of principles around, well, what is an assessment of a plan trying to achieve, and how is it putting it out there, and how can we compare and contrast? And I think if we can get that work done, that's going to give investors like Maria and others confidence around, okay, if there is another assessment on this plan, I know what it means and I can compare and contrast it against other providers. Thanks.
Thank you very much. It's time to wrap up, but thank you very much. There's clearly alignment for the need for global harmonisation of these principles. As you've heard, there's a range of different approaches used. There's a range of different pathways that could take forward. But I think, to your point, Rahul, there's a lot of optimism and appetite to kind of get stuck in and do this work, particularly with the potential for Australia to kind of lean in a leadership role with COP31 or without. So thank you very much for joining and look forward to continuing the discussion with you all.